Genesis 13, 1 through 7, Abraham departs for Bethel. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites dwelt in the land. Overview. On a spiritual or allegorical level, following Philo, Abraham's return from Egypt with his wife can be interpreted to signify the mind that possesses virtue. Abraham's riches of silver and gold represent the word and the mind, Ambrose. Following the interpretation given earlier by Origen and Didymus, his riches reveal God's providence and Abraham's virtue. He calls on the name of the Lord in a desert place, thus revealing that he is a lover of peace and quiet, Chrysostom. The fact that Lot is mentioned as having flocks, herds, and cattle, but not silver and gold, shows that he lacked Abraham's spiritual riches. An etymological explanation of the name Lot suggests an explanation of why he was at one time joined with Abraham and at another time joined with Sodom. As for the discord that arises, no space is large enough for it, Ambrose. Discord among the brethren is the source of all problems, Chrysostom. By analogy, the cattle represent the senses, and the shepherds are those assigned to keep them in check. Ambrose. 13:1, Abraham departs from Egypt. Sarah represents virtue. Ambrose. So Abraham left, taking with him his wife Sarah, which means sovereign, not servant. Therefore it was said to Abraham, "Listen to your wife Sarah. In fact, she who is liberated from the slavery of sin obtains sovereignty, not servitude." Therefore a sound mind possesses sovereign virtue, which has dominion over the bodily senses, which is not subject, which has brought back everything from Egypt, which has not left there any of the norms that regulate her life. Such a mind is not clothed with intemperance or insolence or shameful immodesty, nor is it lacking the veil of prudent wisdom, and it is clothed with modesty. 13:12, Abraham's wealth, spiritual riches, Ambrose. He was very rich, as is natural for one who is not lacking in any good thing, who did not covet the goods of others, because he lacked nothing of what he would have wished it to regard as his own. For this is what it means to be rich, to have what is sufficient to satisfy one's own desires. Frugality has a measure, richness does not. Its measure is in the will of the seeker. He was rich in cattle, in silver, and gold. What does this mean? I do not think that the intention is to praise the riches of this world, but the righteousness of this man. Thus, I understand cattle to be the bodily senses, because they are irrational. Silver represents the word, and gold the mind. Abraham was indeed rich, because he was in control of his irrational senses. Indeed, he tamed them and made them docile, so that they might participate in rationality. His word was radiant with the brightness of faith, purified by the grace of spiritual discipline. His mind was full of prudence, and this is why the good mind is compared with gold, because just as gold is more precious than other metals, so the good mind is the best part among those that make up the human substance. So the richness of the wise man consists in these three things, in sensation, in word, and in mind. Their order establishes a gradation, as we read also in the Apostle. So faith, hope, love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. The mind, too, then, is the greatest, because it is the mind that grinds the spiritual grain to purify the senses and the word. The character of the wise man is preserved at every point. So it is that through the simple facts of Abraham's life, great doctrines are expounded and illustrated. Rich indeed is the one who enriches even the arguments of the philosophers, who would formulate their precepts on the basis of his conduct. It was his riches, then, that Scripture has brought to light. God's providence and Abraham's virtue, Chrysostom. Let us not rush idly by this reading, but rather recognize clearly the precision of sacred Scripture in recounting nothing to us as of no importance. Now Abram was very rich, the text says. Consider first of all this very fact that its habit had been to convey nothing idly or to no purpose. In this case, it is not without reason that the text calls him rich. Nowhere else had it made mention of his being rich. This was the first time. Why, and to what purpose? For you to learn the inventiveness of God's wisdom and providence displayed in favor of the great man, as well as his boundless and extraordinary power. The man who had gone into exile in Egypt under the pressure of famine, unable to sustain the privations of Canaan, suddenly became rich. And not just rich, but very rich, not only in cattle, but also in silver and gold. Do you not see the extent of God's providence? Abraham left to find relief from famine and came back not simply enjoying relief from famine, but invested with great wealth and untold reputation, his identity well known to everyone. Now the inhabitants of Canaan gained a more precise idea of the good man's virtue by seeing this sudden transformation that had taken place. The stranger who had gone down into Egypt as a refugee and vagabond, now flush with so much wealth. 13:3 Abraham calls on the Lord, a lover of peace and quiet, Chrysostom. Consider, I ask you, how he was a lover of peace and quiet and was constantly attentive to divine worship. The text says, remember that he went down to that place where he had previously built the altar. By calling on the name of God, he right from the very beginning fulfilled in anticipation that saying of David, I would rather be of no account in the house of my God than take up residence in sinners' dwellings. In other words, solitude turned out to be preferred by him for invoking the name of God instead of the cities. After all, he well knew that cities' greatness is not constituted by multitude of inhabitants, but by the virtue of its residents. Hence, too, the desert proved to be more desirable than the cities, adorned as it was by the just man's virtue, and thus a more resplendent vision than the whole world. 13:5 Lot's flocks, herds, and tents. Lot lacks Abraham's spiritual riches, Ambrose. It remains to be seen if Lot, too, his nephew, was rich as one who belonged to the same family. But Scripture says only that he had many cattle. In fact, the text reads, Lot also, who went with Abraham, had flocks, herds, and tents. He had no silver because he was not yet just. In fact, the tongue of the just man is like silver purified by fire. He had no gold, which was the possession of the one who saw the posterity of Christ, of whom it is written, and his posterity shines like gold. Abraham saw him, as the Lord testified when he said, Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. This is why he deserved to shine like gold and to have gold as his endowment. Why Lot went with Abraham, Ambrose? It is impossible for me to omit here a discussion of a question that has stumped even the more learned, namely why the text is worded this way, Lot also who went with Abraham, as though we were to understand that there was another Lot who did not go with him. And many believe the problem is as yet unresolved. So to satisfy these and at the same time to abide by the rule of Scripture, we would say that there is one person who takes on two roles. That is one and the same individual. Two things are signified. Numerically, Lot is a single individual. Virtually, he is two. In fact, Lot, according to the Latin interpretation, means declinatio, a deviation. But one can deviate either from the good or from the bad. So when Lot deviates from the bad, that is, from error, from base and criminal behavior, he was joined to his uncle. When he deviated from the good, that is, from what is just, innocent, holy, and sacred, he was joined to baseness. This is why it says, Now Lot too, who accompanied Abraham, because he had not yet chosen Sodom, and he was not dwelling among those who are authors of evil. Thereafter he did not go to live in Sodom, and so it was that he became alienated from himself. He thought of himself as of another, as of one, that is, who withdraws not only from the just man, but even from himself. 13:6 Great possessions. No space large enough, Ambrose. In fact, since Lot had already deliberately begun to deviate from his uncle, the land could not support both of them dwelling together. Indeed, no space can be large enough for those who love discord. Even limited spaces are more than adequate for those who are meek and peace-loving, while for those whose mentality is one of discord, even wide open spaces are too restricted. 13.7 Arguments between the herdsmen, the source of all problems, Chrysostom. Notice how the abundance of their possessions proved to be a major cause for their separation, creating a division, sundering their harmony, and undoing the bond of kinship. Trouble developed between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen. Now the Canaanites and the Perizzites inhabited the land at that time. Notice how the relatives are responsible for the first signs of separation. Invariably, this is the source from which springs all sorts of problems, discord among the brethren. The text says, remember, trouble developed between the herdsmen. They are the ones who provide the occasion for separation, who sunder the harmony, who give evidence of bad feeling. Cattle typify the irrational senses. Ambrose, let us now consider who are the shepherds, and what living creatures they shepherd, and what was the nature of the dispute between the shepherds of Abraham and those of Lot. Shepherds are those who govern the flocks. They are diligent and wise when they do not allow their animals to trample the farmlands with their feet or to damage the crops with their teeth. They are negligent and lazy when they do not invite their cattle to pasture on grassy fields rather than in planted areas, but allow them to wander freely through the various garden crops. These shepherds, then, should be watchfully attentive, so what has happened through the carelessness of the negligent be not attributed to the diligent. But since we are here not speaking of visible things, let us first of all consider what kind of animal they have to shepherd. We can supply a definition of these shepherds. They are shepherds of cattle, says the text. Now cattle, as we have said, signify the irrational senses of the body. Who then are the shepherds of the senses, if not their masters, and in a certain sense their rulers and guides? That is to say, the monitors of a certain way of speaking, or the thoughts of our mind. If these are expert and constant in the pastoral exercise, they do not permit the flocks of the senses to wander off and to stop to graze in useless or positively harmful pastures. But with wise leadership they call them back and apply the brakes of reason to block their activity when they rebel. But the bad leaders, or useless disputes, allow the cattle to be carried away by their own impulsiveness, to run toward the precipice, to trample on planted fields, and to feed on their produce. So much so that if at present there are still fruits of virtue to be found, they destroy even these.